The laughter came first, before the door had even fully closed behind her. It rolled across the marble of the great hall like spilled wine, loud and careless, and at its center stood the Duke himself, one gloved hand braced against a carved oak chair, his shoulders shaking with mirth. "Look what the rain has dragged to my threshold," he said, and the gathered guests, eager as always to mirror his moods, laughed with him. The woman in the doorway did not flinch. Her cloak was plain wool, dark with damp. Her boots were honest leather, scuffed at the toes. Her hair, once the pride of 3 counties, had been bound back beneath a simple bonnet, and her hands, ungloved, were folded before her with the patience of someone who had waited a very long time for this exact moment. "You always did have a flair for entrances, Aldrich," she said quietly. "Tonight you shall remember mine." What happened in the hours that followed would empty Greymoor Hall of every guest by sunrise, strip a duke of his title before the week was out, and leave a name long whispered, with pity ringing instead with awe across every drawing-room in the kingdom. Before we go further into this tale, take a moment, if you would, to subscribe to this channel and to ring the small bell beside it. For stories like this one are written for those who believe that quiet dignity outlasts loud cruelty. Tell me in the comments where in the world you are watching from and what hour the clock shows as you listen, for I read everyone. And if a tale of patient women and arrogant men appeals to you, leave a like before the first carriage arrives, because tonight's story is one you will never forget. Now let us rewind, for to understand the laughter at the door, you must first understand the laughter that had filled that same hall 10 years before, when a younger Aldrich Marrowforth, freshly invested with his late father's coronet and the keys to Greymoor Hall, had stood at the foot of a sweeping staircase and watched a slender girl in cream silk descend toward him. Her name then was Imogen Valmont, and she came from a family older than his own, though by the time of her wedding, the Valmont coffers had grown thin, and the Valmont lands had grown thinner. She brought to the marriage 3 things her new husband valued: a bloodline that polished his own, a bearing trained from childhood in the disciplines of court, and most quietly, a small wooden chest, banded in iron, which she had set with her own hands beside her marriage bed, and which her father had told her, on the morning of the wedding, never to open in front of anyone, and never to speak of, no matter what came. Greymoor Hall in those years was a place of great beauty and greater pride. Its long gallery ran the full eastern face of the house, lined with portraits of Marrowforth dukes in stiff lace collars and ermine, each one painted, it seemed, in the act of looking down. Its dining room could seat 80 without crowding, and on feast nights the table groaned beneath roasted pheasant, glazed venison, towers of crystallized fruit, soft white bread broken open to release steam like incense. Its drawing rooms were hung with damask, the color of crushed roses, its floors laid with parquet imported from a country whose name most of the household could not pronounce, its windows tall enough to swallow the morning. Imogen had loved the house at once, not for its grandeur, but for the way the early light fell across its terraces, and for the kitchen garden where an elderly woman named Mathilde grew herbs in tidy rows and called every flower by its Latin name. To Mathilde, and to the scullery boys, and to the stable hands who lifted their caps as she passed, Imogen had been gentle from her first day, and they had loved her in return with the loyalty that only servants who have known cruelty can give. Aldrich had been charmed at first, in the careless way that handsome men are charmed by what they have just acquired. He praised her at dinners. He set her at his right hand. He had her portrait painted in the cream silk she had worn at their wedding, and hung it, briefly, in the gallery beside his mother. But charm in such men is a thin coat, and within 2 seasons it had begun to wear through at the elbows. He grew bored of her quietness. He grew impatient with the way she preferred the library to the ballroom. He grew suspicious, then resentful, of the small iron-banded chest she kept locked at the foot of her bed and would not let even the chambermaid touch. When he asked her what was in it, she answered, always, with the same words. "Something my father left me. It is not yours to open." And he, being a man who believed all things within his walls were his to open, began at last to hate her for it. The hatred, when it bloomed, did not bloom alone. It was watered by another hand, and that hand belonged to a woman named Seraphine Yarrow, who had been the daughter of a minor baronet, and who had, since girlhood, made it her single ambition to be a duchess. Seraphine was beautiful in the way that frost is beautiful, all glitter and edges, and she had understood from the age of 15 that the surest path to a coronet was not to win one for herself, but to displace whoever stood between her and the man who wore one. She had attended Aldrich and Imogen's wedding with a smile so wide it left her cheeks aching, and she had returned to Greymoor in the years that followed under every pretext she could invent. A misdirected letter that required personal apology, a horse gone lame near the gates, a charitable subscription that simply must be discussed over tea. By the 3rd year of the marriage, she was a fixture at the long table. By the 5th, she was Aldrich's confidant, and by the 6th, she had moved her belongings into a guest suite on the south wing, and, with the help of Aldrich's widowed mother, had begun to refer to herself, in the hearing of certain servants, as the future mistress of Greymoor Hall. The widowed mother was named Drusilla, and she was the enabler in this small theatre of cruelty. Drusilla Marrowforth had buried her husband young, and had spent the intervening decades convinced that her son's marriage to Imogen had been a strategic error, for the Velmont fortune, once examined, proved to be more name than coin. Seraphine, by contrast, was the only child of a baronet, who, though small in title, was rumoured to have invested cleverly in the new shipping lines, and to be worth twice what his rank suggested. Drusilla wanted that money for her son, and she wanted Imogen gone, and she was not particular about the means. The means, when they came, were almost embarrassingly simple. A whispered word here, a misplaced letter there, a perfumed handkerchief left, carefully, in Aldrich's study, where Imogen could not fail to find it. A rumour planted with a chambermaid that Imogen had been seen, late at night, walking with the steward in the orchard. The steward in question was a man of 60, married 30 years, and devoted to his own gentle wife. The rumour was none the less repeated. By the 8th year of the marriage, Aldrich had convinced himself that his wife was cold, that his wife was secretive, that his wife was perhaps even unfaithful, and that the iron-banded chest at the foot of her bed contained love letters from a former suitor. He demanded, one evening at supper, that she open it before him and Seraphine and his mother. She refused. She refused calmly, without heat, the way one refuses to step into a river one has been told runs deep. He struck her then, for the first time, an open-handed blow across the cheek that left a red mark fading slowly toward her jaw, and Seraphine, seated across the table with a glass of pale wine in her hand, did not lower her eyes. She smiled the small, satisfied smile of a player who has just turned a winning card. Imogen rose from her chair without a word. She bowed her head once, the bow of a guest taking leave, not of a wife retreating, and she walked from the dining-room and up the great staircase and into her chamber, where she sat for a long while in the dark, with her hand pressed to her cheek and her other hand resting, lightly, upon the iron-banded chest. The next morning, a letter was issued from the Duke's study, sealed with the Marrowforth crest, and witnessed by his mother and by Seraphine, declaring the marriage dissolved on grounds of the wife's unsuitability and ordering her removal from Greymore Hall within the week. Imogen made no protest. She packed 3 plain dresses, a cloak, a Bible that had belonged to her grandmother, and the iron-banded chest. She left behind her wedding silks, her jewels, the portrait in the gallery, and the small dog that had slept at the foot of her bed, and whom Seraphine had already, the day before, claimed as her own. She walked out of the front gates of Greymore Hall on a grey morning in late autumn, with the elderly Mathilde weeping into her apron at the kitchen door, and she did not look back. The servants whispered, for a season, that they had seen her climb into a plain hired carriage at the end of the long drive, and that a tall man in dark travelling clothes had handed her up into it with the deference of a courtier handing up a queen. They were told, sharply, by Drusilla, to mind their work and forget what they thought they had seen. For the 10 years that followed, the name Imogen Velmont was spoken at Greymore Hall only in the past tense, and only with a sigh of pity. She was the new mistress of the house, liked to say at her dinners, a poor, sad creature who had simply not been equal to the demands of her station. She had returned, no doubt, to whatever crumbling cottage her people still held in the north. She had likely taken in sewing. She had, one wit suggested over the soup course, been seen scrubbing steps in a market town 2 counties over, though when pressed for details the wit could produce none. The pity was performed with great care, for pity is a fine garment to wear when one has stolen another woman's house, and Seraphine wore it daily. She had married Aldrich within the year of the dissolution. She had taken Imogen's seat at the long table. She had ordered the cream silk portrait removed from the gallery and stored in an attic, where damp had eventually found it. She had refurnished the drawing rooms in the colour of crushed apricots, which she felt suited her complexion better, and she had hosted, in the decade of her reign, no fewer than 3 masked balls at which her own beauty had been the central decoration. She had borne Aldrich no children, which was, she said, a sorrow, but the sorrow had not been deep enough to interrupt her shopping. Aldrich, for his part, had aged in the manner of men who have eaten and drunk too well for too long, and have heard too much of their own importance. His shoulders had thickened, his hairline had retreated, his laugh, once careless, had grown loud and a little hollow, the laugh of a man who needs his amusement to be witnessed. He had spent freely, in the decade, on horses and on a new gallery wing, and on a private box at the opera in the capital. He had borrowed, lightly at first and then less lightly, against the estate. He had assumed, as his fathers had assumed before him, that the estate could bear any borrowing, for Greymore Hall and its 3,000 acres, and its mills and its tenanted villages had stood for 400 years, and would stand 400 or more. He had not, in all that time, examined the small leather folio kept in the lowest drawer of the steward's desk, in which the true history of the estate's deeds and the true names of its lienholders were recorded in a careful hand. He had not, in all that time, asked himself why the bank in the capital, when he sought new credit, had begun in recent years to require unusually little collateral, as though the loans were being guaranteed by some unseen party. He had not, in all that time, wondered who had quietly bought up the 3 smaller estates that bordered his own, nor why the new owners, whoever they were, had never once visited, never once attended a county gathering, never once introduced themselves. He had simply assumed that he was, as he had always been, the largest man in his small, bright world. Meanwhile, In a city far to the south, in a quiet stone house behind a quiet stone wall, a woman in plain dark dresses had been doing the patient work of a decade. The iron-banded chest had been opened, at last, on the night of her arrival, by the tall man in dark travelling clothes, who had handed her up into the carriage. He was her father's oldest friend, and her late father's chosen executor, and he was also one of the most discreet bankers in the southern kingdoms. Inside the chest had lain, not love letters and not jewels, but documents, share certificates in 3 shipping concerns, a controlling interest in a northern ironworks, the deeds to 2 coastal warehouses, a letter in her father's hand addressed to her alone, beginning with the words, "My dearest girl, the world will try to value you by your husband. Do not let it. What lies within this chest is yours, and yours only, and shall be your shield should any man ever raise his hand against you." Her father had been, in his lifetime, a man whom few outside the merchant courts had known by name, and whom those few had spoken of with hushed respect. He had built, in 3 decades, one of the largest private fortunes in the kingdom, and he had concealed it carefully behind quiet companies and trusted partners, so that no suitor for his only daughter's hand would marry her for the wealth she didn't appear to possess. He had wanted, he had told her once, a man who would love her for the steadiness of her spirit. He had not lived to see how badly he had been mistaken in Aldrich Marrowforth, but he had lived long enough before the marriage to place every paper she would ever need into the iron-banded chest, and to write the name of his oldest friend upon the inside of the lid. That oldest friend had received her at the southern house, had read with her her father's letter, had counted with her the certificates, and had said simply, "Madame, you are richer than your husband by a factor of 7. What would you have me do?" She had thought for a long while before answering. "Nothing," she had said at last. "Not yet. Let him spend. Let him borrow. Let him forget me. And when at last he stands at the edge of his own ruin, bring me to him." The 10 years had been spent in the careful, invisible work of bringing him there. Quietly, through agents who did not know one another's names, Imogen had instructed her father's bank to extend credit to the Duke of Marrowforth whenever he sought it, on terms generous enough to seem flattering and discreet enough to seem ordinary. Quietly, through other agents, she had bought up the 3 neighboring estates that her husband had always assumed he would one day annex. Quietly, through still other agents, she had purchased the mortgages on Greymore Hall itself, 1 tranche at a time, as the old county banks that had held them found themselves approached by polite gentlemen with full purses. Quietly, she had funded a hospital in the nearest market town, and a school in the village that lay at the foot of the Greymore Drive, and the villagers, who knew the name of their benefactress only as a distant lady of the South, had learned to bless that name in their prayers. Quietly, she had kept a small correspondence with old Mathilde, the herb gardener, through letters carried by a cousin of the cook, and she had known, year by year, who at Greymore Hall was kind, and who was cruel, who had been turned out without a pension, and who had been favoured, which scullery girl had been struck for breaking a plate, and which footman had been dismissed for the crime of looking too long at the new Duchess. She had remembered all of it. She had remembered, too, the small things, the way Seraphine had taken her little dog, the way Drusilla had laughed when the cream silk portrait had been carried up to the attic, the way Aldrich had struck her at the supper table, with Seraphine smiling across the candles. She was not a woman who hated easily, but she was a woman who did not forget. And so when the message came to her in the spring of the 10th year, that the Duke of Marrowforth had at last borrowed beyond his capacity to pay, that the interest upon the mortgages now exceeded the rents from his lands, that the bank in the capital had, with great regret, called in his largest note. She had set down the message beside her teacup, and she had said to her father's old friend, who sat across from her, "It is time." Graymore Hall, on the evening she returned to it, was hosting one of Seraphine's celebrated suppers. The drive was lined with carriages. The windows blazed with the light of 100 candles. The dining room, refurnished in apricot damask, was laid for 40, and the conversation had reached that pitch of brittle merriment which precedes the serving of the dessert. The Duke sat at the head of the table in a coat of deep wine velvet, his face flushed, his glass raised. The Duchess sat at the foot in a gown of pale gold, her dark hair piled high and pinned with the Marrowforth diamonds, which she had at last persuaded her husband to take from the strong room and let her wear. Drusilla sat at her son's right hand, thinner than she had been a decade ago, sharper in the chin, her eyes still bright with the small pleasures of having outlasted the daughter-in-law she had despised. A storm had risen outside in the past hour. The rain struck the long windows in sheets. The wind moved through the chimneys with a sound like distant weeping. It was into this scene that the front door of Graymore Hall opened, and a footman, very pale, announced into the dining room that a woman had arrived at the gate, on foot, alone, in the rain, and was asking for the Duke by name. "On foot," said Seraphine with delight. "In this weather. Who is she?" The footman hesitated. He had been at Graymore only 3 years. He did not know the face. But the housekeeper, who stood behind him in the doorway, did. The housekeeper was an old woman now, and she had served Imogen Velmont in her brief reign with quiet love, and she had been kept on, after the dissolution, only because she had been clever enough never to say so. Her face, when she stepped into the candlelight, had gone the colour of paper. "Your Grace," she said, her voice not entirely steady, "it is the Lady Imogen." A silence fell upon the table that was not quite silence, for the rain still beat at the windows, and somewhere in the depths of the house a clock chimed the half-hour. Then Aldrich Marrowforth, Duke of Marrowforth, master of Graymore Hall, laughed. He laughed the way he had laughed at the door 10 years before, the way he had laughed at his own jokes for a decade, loud and easy, and inviting his guests to join him. And they did, for they were the sort of guests who joined whatever their host began. "Imogen," he said, when he had wiped his eyes. "Imogen Velmont, walking up my drive in the rain like a beggar. Well, of course. Where else would she go in the end? Show her in, by all means. Let her see what she lost." Seraphine, at the foot of the table, set down her glass with the small, careful motion of a woman who has just smelled smoke and means to pretend she has not. "Aldrich," she said softly, "do you think it wise? On such an evening, with such company?" "Wise?" He turned to her, expansive, magnanimous. "My dear, it is charity. It is the duty of our station. The poor creature has come at last to ask for help. She shall have it. A bowl of soup at the kitchen door and a coin for the road. Let her in. Let her stand in the hall. Let her see the table she once sat at, and let her see who sits at it now." The footman bowed and withdrew, and the housekeeper, whose eyes had not left the floor, withdrew with him. The guests, sensing entertainment, leaned forward in their chairs. Drusilla Marrowforth, at her son's right hand, was the only person at the table whose face had not arranged itself into anticipation. She had grown old enough, in the last decade, to feel the cold spots in a room before others felt them, and there was a cold spot in this room now that had nothing to do with the storm. She looked once at her son. She looked once at Seraphine. She opened her mouth to say something, and then closed it again, for the door of the dining room had opened, and the woman in the wool cloak had come in. She did not come in as a beggar comes. She came in as a woman walks who has measured a distance for 10 years and has at last arrived at the end of it. The hem of her cloak was dark with rain. Her bonnet she had removed in the hall, and her hair, plain dark hair beginning to silver at the temples, was bound in a simple knot at the nape of her neck. Her face was thinner than it had been at 20, and there were lines at the corners of her eyes that had not been there when she had walked out of these gates, and yet the face was the same face, and every servant standing along the walls of the dining room knew it at once, and one of them, a girl who had not been born when the Lady Imogen had left, knew it too, because the housekeeper had described it to her many times, in whispers, in the long winter evenings when the new Duchess was away. Imogen walked the length of the dining room slowly, not looking at the guests, not looking at Seraphine, not looking at Drusilla. She walked to a point 3 paces from the head of the table, and there she stopped, and there she folded her hands before her, and there she lifted her eyes at last to the face of the man who had been her husband. "Good evening, Uldric," she said. Her voice was lower than he remembered. It carried in the room without seeming to be raised. "Good evening, Imogen." He had recovered his composure. He leaned back in his chair, one arm draped across its carved back, the picture of a duke at ease. "You are wet. You are also, I think, lost. The almshouse is in the village, 2 miles down the drive and to the left. I am sure my steward can spare a lantern." A small laugh ran around the table. Seraphine joined it, a beat late. Imogen did not laugh. She did not smile. She said simply, "I have not come for charity. I have come for an accounting." "An accounting," he smiled, indulgent. "Of what, pray? Of our brief and unfortunate marriage?" "My dear, that was settled by law a decade ago. There is nothing to account. You were found wanting. You were dismissed. You went, as I recall, very quietly, which was the one act of grace you ever showed this house." "I went quietly," she agreed, "because there was nothing then to be gained by speaking. There is now." She turned her head, for the first time, toward Seraphine. She regarded the woman at the foot of the table for a long moment, the pale gold gown, the Marrow-Forth diamonds, the dark hair piled high. "You wear my mother-in-law's stones well," she said. "I am glad some woman has. They never suited me." Seraphine's smile did not move, but a small muscle at her jaw tightened. "They were given to me," she said, "by my husband, as was this house, as was every stone of it." "Ah," said Imogen. "Yes. We shall come to the house." She turned back to Uldric. From within the folds of her cloak, she drew a leather folio, slim, dark, banded in brass at the corners. She set it upon the white linen of the table, midway between her place and his. The candles caught the brass and threw small bright squares against the apricot damask of the wall. "Before I open this," she said, "I shall give you the chance to send your guests home. What is contained here is not a matter for an audience. I would not wish you to be unmade in front of 40 witnesses, Uldric, if you would prefer to be unmade in private. The choice is yours. I offer it once." There was a silence. The rain beat at the windows. Uldric Marrow-Forth looked at the folio. He looked at his former wife, standing plain and damp in his dining room. He looked at his current wife, whose smile had finally begun to slip at the edges. He looked at his guests, who had ceased to lean forward, and had begun, several of them, to lean back. And he made the mistake that vain men have made in every century of the world. He laughed again. "Unmade," he said. "Unmade. By you. In my own house. Imogen, I had forgotten how amusing you could be when you tried. Open your little folder. Read us your little papers. Let us all have our entertainment for the evening, and then you may go to the kitchen and be fed, and one of the grooms will drive you back to whatever hole you crawled from." She did not nod. She did not sigh. She simply reached forward and opened the folio. The first paper she lifted from it was a single sheet, heavy, official, sealed at the bottom in red wax, with a seal that several of the older men at the table recognized at once. One of them, a banker from the capital who had been invited because Seraphine collected bankers, sat very suddenly straighter in his chair. "This," said Imogen, "is the deed of trust upon Greymoor Hall, and its 3,411 acres, together with the mills at Greymoor Bridge, the tenanted farms of the home estate, and the rights of way that connect them to the public road. It was held until the spring of last year by a consortium of 3 county banks. In the spring of last year, it was bought, in its entirety, by a single private holder. The holder's name is recorded at the foot of the document. Perhaps your banker friend, since he has gone so pale, would care to read it aloud." The banker did not move. He stared at the paper as though it might bite him. "I shall read it then," said Imogen. "The holder of the deed of trust upon Greymoor Hall is Imogen Velmont, spinster, of the southern county, sole heir of the late Edmund Velmont, merchant." She set the paper down. She lifted a second. "This is the note of credit upon which you borrowed, 2 years ago, the sum of 40,000 crowns to refurbish the East Gallery and to purchase the racing string at the spring meet. It was extended to you by the Royal Mercantile Bank in the capital. The Royal Mercantile Bank is, and has been since the year of my father's death, a wholly owned subsidiary of the Velmont Trust, of which I am, and have been since the year of my father's death, the sole principal. The note is overdue by 7 months. Interest has accrued. I have, until this evening, declined to call it in." She set the paper down. She lifted a third. "These are the mortgages upon the dower house, the south pasture, the orchard, the stables, the chapel, and the family burial ground. Each was contracted separately, with separate lenders, over the course of the last 6 years. Each was bought by my agents, separately, without your knowledge, as they were offered for sale upon the secondary market. They are now held in a single bundle by the Velmont Trust. They are, every one of them, in default." She set the paper down. She did not lift a fourth. There were 4 more in the folio, but they were not, at this moment, necessary. The room had stopped breathing. Several of the servants along the walls had dropped, very quietly, to one knee, in the old country gesture of fealty offered to the true holder of a great estate. The banker from the capital had risen from his chair and bowed, low, in Imogen's direction, and had sat back down without speaking. One of the maids, the youngest, had begun to cry, soundlessly, with her apron pressed against her mouth. Drusilla Marrowforth, at her son's right hand, had closed her eyes. Seraphine was the first to speak, and she spoke too quickly. "This is a fraud," she said. "This is a forgery. This is some scheme cooked up by a bitter woman who could not hold her husband. Aldrich, send for the magistrate. Send for the sheriff. Have her removed at once." Imogen did not look at her. She looked at Aldrich. Aldrich had not moved. His hand still rested upon the carved back of his chair, but the fingers had whitened upon the wood. His face had gone the color of old tallow. His mouth was slightly open. He was looking at the 3 papers upon the white linen, as a man looks at the bottom of a well into which he has just dropped his only lamp. "Aldrich," said Imogen, gently. the way one speaks to a child who has at last understood the consequence of a broken vase. The magistrate has already been sent for. He will arrive within the hour. He is bringing with him the sheriff of the county and 2 officers of the bank, who will take inventory of the contents of this house against the debts that are owed. You will not be permitted to remove anything of value tonight. Tomorrow, you and your wife and your mother will be permitted to leave Greymore Hall with such personal effects as the officers determine to be your own. The diamonds upon your wife's hair are not your own. They were entailed with the house by your grandfather, and they pass with the deed. Seraphine's hand flew to her hair. Imogen turned to her, finally, and looked at her with the patient, mild gaze of a woman regarding a small, unpleasant insect upon a window-sill. "You will take them off," she said, "before the magistrate arrives. You will hand them to the housekeeper, who will hand them to me. You will not be searched, if you comply. If you do not comply, you will be searched. The choice, again, is yours. I am offering choices tonight that were not offered to me." Seraphine did not move. Her hand stayed at her hair. Her eyes, very wide now, darted from Imogen to Aldrich, to Drusilla and back. "Aldrich," she whispered. "Aldrich, say something. Aldrich, do something." Aldrich Marrowforth opened his mouth. He closed it. He opened it again. The sound that came out was not a word. It was a small, thick noise, the noise of a man whose throat has closed around the thing he meant to say. Imogen turned from him, as one turns from a fire that has at last gone out. She looked now at the guests. She looked at them slowly, one face at a time, and several of them dropped their eyes as her gaze passed over them. For several of them had been at Greymore Hall the night she had been struck at this same table, and several of them had laughed then, and several of them remembered now that they had laughed. "I shall not ask you to leave," she said to them. "You came as guests of the Duke of Marrowforth. You shall remain as witnesses. The magistrate will wish to take statements. You will give them honestly, or you will find that the credit upon which several of you have lately depended has also, by curious coincidence, passed into Velmont hands." She turned, last, to Drusilla. The old woman had opened her eyes again, and she was looking at her former daughter-in-law with an expression that was not quite hatred. It was something older. It was the expression of a person who has spent 40 years being clever and has just discovered, in a single moment, that she has not been clever enough. "Drusilla," said Imogen, "I bear you no particular ill will. You did what mothers of your kind have always done. You wanted a richer wife for your son. You shall have the consolation, in your remaining years, of knowing that you got one. I am, by some measure, the richest woman in this kingdom, and I am, by law, still entitled to call myself the first Duchess of Marrowforth, for the dissolution your son signed was procured by fraud, and has, this afternoon, been set aside by the ecclesiastical court at my petition. The marriage between your son and the woman now seated at the foot of this table was therefore never valid. She is not, and never has been, a duchess. She is a baronet's daughter who has been wearing a stolen name for 10 years. A small sound escaped Seraphine then, a sound that was not quite a word and not quite a sob. She rose from her chair. She sat down again. She rose a second time. Her hand was still at her hair, and now, slowly, with fingers that had begun to tremble, she began to draw out the pins. The Marrowforth diamonds came down from her dark hair, one stone at a time, and were laid upon the white linen of the table beside the leather folio, and they caught the candlelight and threw it back as cold and bright as winter. No one at the table spoke. Outside, the rain had begun to slacken. From the long drive came, faintly, the sound of hooves and the sound of carriage wheels upon wet gravel. Many wheels, more than one carriage, the measured advance of an arrival that had been timed to the minute. The footman appeared at the dining-room door, his face composed now, his bow low. "Your ladyship," he said, addressing Imogen and not Seraphine, and the address fell upon the room like a small bell rung in a chapel. "The magistrate has arrived. The sheriff is with him. There are also 2 officers of the Royal Mercantile Bank, and a clerk, and behind them upon the drive there are 3 carriages of attendants in the Velmont livery, awaiting your instruction." "Thank you," said Imogen. "Show them to the great hall. I shall receive them there in a moment." The footman bowed and withdrew. Imogen turned, one last time, to the man at the head of the table. He had not moved. The whiteness had spread from his fingers up the back of his hand. His eyes, which had laughed at her in the doorway less than an hour before, were fixed upon the 3 papers and could not seem to lift. "Aldrich," she said, and her voice now was neither cold nor warm but only level, the voice of a woman who has at last set down a burden she has carried for 10 years. "I shall not raise my hand to you. I shall not raise my voice to you. I shall not have you struck, though I could, and I shall not have you imprisoned, though by the terms of the fraudulent dissolution I could do that also. You will be permitted to leave this house tomorrow, with the clothes upon your back and 1 trunk of personal effects. You will be permitted to keep the title that was your father's, for titles are the affair of the crown and not of me, though you will find, I think, that a duke without an estate is an object of pity at every table in the kingdom, and pity, as you have taught me, is a heavy cloak to wear. You will go where you can go. You will live as you can live. And you will remember, every morning when you wake, that the woman you laughed at in your doorway tonight is the woman who fed you and clothed you and roofed you for the last 6 years of your life, without your knowing it, because she was patient, and because her father loved her, and because some debts grow larger when left unpaid." She reached forward then. She gathered the 3 papers back into the leather folio. She closed the folio. She tucked it once more within the folds of her damp wool cloak. She turned, and she walked the length of the dining room as slowly as she had walked into it, and at the door she paused, and she looked back, not at Aldrich, not at Seraphine, not at Drusilla, but at the old housekeeper who stood by the wall with both her hands pressed against her mouth and tears running freely down the lines of her face. "Mathilde is in the kitchen garden still?" Imogen asked. The housekeeper could not speak. She nodded. "Tell her," said Imogen, "that I shall come down to her in the morning. Tell her the roses she planted by the south wall are the first thing I mean to see." And then she went out into the great hall, where the magistrate and the sheriff and the officers of the bank were already standing in a respectful half-circle, and where, beyond the open front door, the 3 carriages of attendants in the dark green Velmont livery were drawn up in formation upon the wet gravel, their lanterns burning steady against the slackening rain, waiting for the word of the woman who had at last come home.